for, which the only thing that people are interested in is doing.
I read the page this morning. I'm glad I didn't. Well, they have the statistic on that 3 points with middle. They scored 4 points. No, stole the ball. They stole the ball. One. So then they stole the ball. The third time, I got it somewhere. 25 seconds. Drive down the court and drive another layup. Elmore got the rebounds or foul. So missed the layup. Missed both.
How's that? Is it 2 hours?
So they come down and score 4 seconds. I was really wanting to the ball, so they give a Well, it makes sense. 2 types of ball. It's that's sort of one. I haven't worked on this
It's 6 seconds. 2:07.
Where are you going? Well,
Well, I have various sample questions that will be available afterwards. I don't think I'll go over them now or anything like that, but they are here afterwards. And there were some remarks that introduced them that I hope will explain to you the intention and so forth and the kind of thing to do. And you'll be able to talk to Renee's instructors about the topic. I presume you'll have obviously other suggestions, other things you would want to do. And the papers are due, the date we're asking them to do is the 9th of May. In order that you will have them in early enough so you don't use a whole reading period on the paper and so forth. All that's explained on here, and the length and everything of that kind. I would like to ask whether, well, or if Andrew Dwyer or Kate Bissell are here, would they see me afterwards? And the others that I talked to the other day about the examination, you would see me afterwards. Tell me what you had decided. Let's see, the other thing I should say that on Wednesday, we will meet here at this hour. So there won't be class on Friday, and then beginning next week we'll take our, we'll go back to our normal schedule. Okay? And then that means that the Wednesday sections I should add, so we'll be on Friday, but I don't know at that time. Well, the other day I talked about the basis of equality of the basic liberties in TJ by contrasting that basis with the basis of their equality in nil. And today what I want to do, although I don't give any means an adequate account, it's a very hard thing to do. In fact, I don't think anywhere I've offered an adequate account. I want to say something about the basis of the priority. So we talk both about their equality and priority, distinguish between those. And the last time I made comments on Mill, I raised not exactly an objection. I pointed out something about his view that might raise a problem about it. I was abstracting from the fact that his is, in a sense, a moral philosophy or moral view in the sense in which TJ is a political conception. It is, of course, a moral conception, but it's a more narrowly drawn. I was overlooking that aspect of it. Now, recall that in drawing up a scheme of basic liberties, there isn't anything, if it's something I mentioned the last time in passing, there isn't anything that we're attempting to maximize, except in the trivial sense, of course, that one's always trying to act from the best reasons or acting on the balance of reasons. But other than that, there isn't any, as it were, thing, any other notion one's trying to maximize. The idea is to look at a scheme of basic liberties that protects for each citizen the adequate development and the full exercise of the two moral powers in what I there called the other day the two fundamental cases. And here the idea of maximizing does not, I think, apply, because we cannot maximize the adequate development and the full exercise of two moral powers, since we cannot maximize with respect to two objectives at once. And maximizing with respect to either moral power, or even indeed maximizing with respect to both, if that makes sense, would not be a sensible objective, because, as I mentioned, passing, there are other things about human life that are fundamental and that are important besides exercising the moral powers, namely all kinds of things that we do fall under our conception of good, and just to maximize the moral powers, the exercise of that, would put a kind of emphasis on the moral life and aspects of it that I think once we think about it, really doesn't make sense. And the point here, I might elaborate a bit, is that the moral powers are complementary with other desires that we have. So that the point of having a moral view, the point of having a political doctrine of justice, lies in part in the fact that people have other desires, other aims and objectives that are not moral objectives in any ordinary sense. So that we might say the point of morality is that we have these other desires as well. And if we didn't, then morality would have no point. So if you imagine a world, or try to imagine a world in which the only thing that people are interested in is doing the right thing and nothing else, they don't desire to do anything else, you think that through. It has a kind of oddity about it. And there's an aspect of Kant's view, if you press it hard, I think, where it's in danger of falling afoul of that difficulty, but I won't go into that. That's a deep problem in the interpretation of Kant's view. Now, a practicable scheme of the basic liberties that cannot, I think, be specified in sufficient detail by the parties in the original position. And I thought I would just mention that. It is sufficient if their role and their structure and the general content of these liberties can be outlined sufficiently, and the grounds of their priority understood in that position. But we don't have to be able to work out the details. So what's assumed is that the further specification of those liberties is left to these other stages that are talked about in section 31, that is the stage of the Constitutional Convention, the legislative stage, and the judicial stage. Imagine it being there, and it's in those stages that there is more information available, and I give a very brief account in section 131 of how that's supposed to go. Now, one comment on that sequence, the one on the four-stage sequence, it is not intended as a description of any actual political process, and much less is it an account of how any constitutional regime might actually be expected to operate. So in that sense, it's not a political theory at all. It isn't an account of how institutions work, but instead it's a schema for applying the principles of justice and for specifying their content in a more definite way, e.g. the content of basic liberties, when more information is available and the need for greater specification arises. For example, the index of primary goods in some way doesn't have to be specified precisely in the original position, but the idea of an index, the general form and structure of it ought to be, and then depending on the specific characteristics and nature of the society and so on, it can be made more definite if it needs to be. Well, those are some preliminary comments, cutting up and adding on to some things that I said at the end of last time. Now I'll make a few observations about priority of the basic liberty. Recall that no basic liberty is absolute. Since these liberties may conflict with one another in particular cases, and therefore their claims have to be somehow adjusted. The aim is to make these adjustments in such a way that at least the most significant liberties would secure the adequate development and the full exercise of the two moral powers in what I call the last time the two fundamental cases are normally compatible. And I think that the historical experience of constitutional regimes and democratic constitutions indicates that at least under favorable circumstances it is possible to do that. That doesn't mean that there are no conflicts that remain, but on the whole it's possible under favorable conditions to arrange and define a scheme of that kind. So the point then is that it's this scheme of basic liberties as a whole that has priority. And any element in it can be adjusted and may be required to be adjusted for the sake of other liberties in the scheme. But that scheme as a whole is the thing that has the priority. Nevertheless, this whole scheme wouldn't have priority unless particular liberties themselves were of fundamental importance. So they are going to have to be fundamentally important in some respect. So let's consider as an example case of liberty of conscience and indicate the kind of grounds that the parties have for adopting it. And here I'm just going over in a somewhat different way the argument to give in section 33, chapter 4. Now I understand liberty of conscience to cover religious, philosophical, and moral views and the general discussion of them, thinking of these as views of the world generally and of our relation to it, in the light of which we interpret and understand our own conception of the good. Now, the parties that cannot be sure that the person each represents affirms such views, they cannot be sure of that. Perhaps they won't. But this person who's being represented may do so, and even if they don't now, they may want to do so later. So we call that what one is protecting is a person over a whole life. So that's why we always, well, not always, but often add that phrase, being a normally cooperating member of society over a whole life. So if they don't now affirm such a view, they may want to in the future, and that possibility has to be represented and allowed for. The parties assume that these views, this a way to put the argument, are already held and fully firm and fully formed and held. And in this sense, then they are given. Now, one then thinking of them as adult citizens in that light. On the other hand, that is, the parties are also responsible for the next generation on the grounds that people who they represent care for the next generation. And so they're also concerned with the conditions of the adequate development of the moral powers and their exercise. Now, if but one of the alternatives principles is available on the menu that parties have to select between, if only one of those alternatives guarantees equal measure of conscience, then the principle guarantees that must be adopted. We call this is what we argue. I think that's on handout. That is the formal structure of the argument for that. So on handout 7, C and D. And here I'm assuming that it's now, but these principles are practicable, that they're workable principles. If they are not, why then of course this argument would fail. Now, the veil of ignorance then will imply that parties do not know and cannot estimate the probability of whether the beliefs that are espoused by the person that they represent are a majority or a minority doctrine. And they cannot take chances by permitting a lesser conscience to minority religions on the possibility that those they represent are in the majority or in the dominant religion, and will therefore have an even greater liberty. The argument is they can't, as if we gamble on that. Where the parties that they gamble in this way, they would show that they did not take seriously the religious, philosophical, and moral convictions of the persons they represent. In effect, they would show that they did not know what a religious or philosophical or moral conviction was. Now, what I just said is not an argument. At least I don't believe it's an argument. I don't intend it as such. What is being done is simply to call attention to the nature of these convictions and the fact that they are regarded in a certain way. They are regarded as non-negotiable, one might say. And this helps to explain why the first principle of justice has priority over the second, and the considerations that fall under the different principle, and so forth. And it also connects up with the intractable nature of religious, philosophical, and moral conflicts, unless there is some constitutional arrangement agreed to that protects the equal liberties. In other words, the suggestion is that that's the only feasible arrangement once one takes into account the nature of these claims that are in conflict and their non-negotiable character. Now, suppose someone were to deny that every conscience is basic liberty on the grounds that all human interests are of any kind are commensurable. This would mean that there's always some rate of exchange. You might say there's always some trade-off, to use the word commonly introduced, in terms of which it's rational to balance the extent of the satisfaction of one interest against the satisfaction of the extent of the satisfaction of another. Suppose someone says that's always the case, so this idea of it being a sharp dividing line, or some kind of lexicographical ordering, or whatever you want to call it, is not the case, and indeed it's irrational, because there is always this trade-off. If someone holds that, then I think I would maintain, well, we have reached a kind of impasse about this. I don't believe that is so. It might be an impasse over how rationalities be understood. It might be an impasse over how certain interests are to be regarded. It might be an impasse that have all kinds of things behind it. And it would be a matter of exploring in a particular case what the possibilities are that lie behind it. Is there some view of the nature of the self? Is there some view about political matters? Is there some view about the nature of rights and so on? One would just have to explore that. But one way to continue the discussion would be to try to work out a scheme of the kind that does have this sort of priority in it, and to show that this scheme can be done in a coherent way, and it leads to a workable conception of justice that is appropriate to the basic structure of a democratic regime, and that it is a congruence with various convictions, fundamental convictions that are embedded in its public culture. And I think, for example, if we examine what's behind it, and I mention this briefly, say the notion of inalienable rights, one does not normally enforce a contract on the part of someone who, say, sells himself into slavery or something analogous to that. If the beneficiary of the contract tries to enforce it against the will of the person who agreed to it, then the court will not normally, and I think ought not to, enforce it. And it doesn't matter whether the person has, under, say, voluntary, uncoerced conditions, agreed to it or not. That's what inalienability means. And that I take to be a reflection of the fact, or that is reflected in this view, in the fact that the agreement of the parties in the original position is enforced, you might say, against citizens in society. So that this priority of the basic liberties was going to prevent them from making certain sorts of agreements. So this, I think, does match and coincides with the attitudes that we take towards the inalienability of certain rights. And again, that voting is a right that we don't think someone could sell. It isn't that people don't sell them. It isn't that they're not bought in some sense. But we wouldn't enforce in court a contract for selling. And indeed, someone might do things, they acquire obligations in the course of a political campaign towards people, and they might feel bound, and morally bound, to vote for certain people. But nevertheless, even if it were wrong for them not to vote for them, it would not be the case that we would think it is legally correct, I think, to enforce that. So again, that would be a reflection of what it takes to be the priority of the basic liberties and the inalienability of it. The kind of example I had in mind by acquiring an obligation is that if you're working for a candidate, you might then be morally bound to vote for that candidate. It might even be wrong for you, and other vices perhaps involved if you don't do that. But nevertheless, it could not be enforced. I don't think we think it ought to be enforced. Well, that's an example. Now, I want to say a few things about the fair value of the political liberties. It is not supposed, on this view, that the basic liberties are equally important, or that they are all valued for the same reasons. One strand of the liberal tradition regards the equal political liberties as of less intrinsic value than, say, for example, freedom of thought and liberty of conscience. And what this means is, or what this is referring to, is the fact that participation in public political life, which is guaranteed by the equal political liberties, generally does have, or rather generally does not have, in present-day society, in a large democratic state, a central and dominant place in the lives of most people. And it reasonably may have a lesser place than a lot of other activities that we don't think of as connected in any way with public life, or the conception of the good of most people. Public life is not now the focus of modern democratic society as it was in the ancient city-state, particularly in mine Athens. And here, however, one must add among native males that were born into a dean, made one citizen of Athens. One always has to add that because there's a certain, I don't want to go on about this, but people often offer it as an example. One has to remember that Athens was a city of about 300,000, roughly, and only 30 to 35,000 out of males could attend the assembly and had political power. And that excluded, of course, all women, aliens, and lots of slaves. And one has to ask to what extent that made it possible to take this view of public life and of its importance. After all, if only 1 in 10 can exercise political power, it obviously, for those who can do so, is going to play an important part in their life, because they will then know that they have power over, say, 9 of the 10 people that they see. But that's not possible for us, and it makes a major difference as to how it can be viewed. Anyway, I'm not going on about that. That's a large subject. We have to remember that sociological and political background. Now, but the political liberties, even if this is so, can still be counted as basic, even if they are essential, only as instrumental means to protect and to preserve other liberties. It does seem plausible to suppose that they are essential in this respect, that is, minorities and other groups that are denied the franchise and excluded from political office and so on are likely to have their basic rights and liberties curtailed, or at least narrowed, if not denied. This suffices, I think, for the parties to include the political liberties in any adequate scheme of basic liberties. Or rather, since this is already done, the principles understood to include these liberties, be better to say that it's not for the parties to prefer a list of principles that includes them. Of course, when they do not, the sort of a final comment on this, have to assert that for most people, political liberties are merely instrumental. Perhaps that isn't the case for most people. But what we want to do is to allow for that possibility and to take no definite stand on what the percentage is, because we know on the whole that in a large modern democratic state, it can't play the same role, that is, it being public political life can't play the same role that it did for adult males in ancient Athens. But that will not mean that these liberties are not important. Now, I'll pass on to another comment about the fair value of the political liberties. Now, the problem here is this, that we saw on handout 7, sections C and D, which is the end of it, the last part of it, that the principles for the basic liberties and their priority would be accepted, or I get to that argument there, provided that there are complementary principles, and here I have in mind particularly the difference principle that provides a fair share of all-purpose material means for persons to advance their conception of the good. As I said, that's the role of the DP in order to, the difference principle is to do that. Now, in the case of the political liberties, there's a special problem. Namely, how are we going to answer the long-standing objection that the political liberties are merely formal? Now, I take that to mean that while it may appear that citizens are equal, as under the two principles, even suppose they were in effect and they were satisfied, that nevertheless it may be the case that social and economic inequalities that exist in background institutions, that is, things that operate and organize and shape everyday life and so forth, are so great that those with greater wealth can effectively control through better positions of responsibility and so forth and so on, the direction of legislation and the content of social policy and so on. And of course, this is an objection that Marx makes, and the socialist tradition in general makes. So this is a serious problem. Now, to discuss this problem, let's distinguish between the worth of liberty and liberty in the following way. We can say that the equal basic liberties are the same for all citizens, and the question of how to compensate anybody for having a lesser liberty in that sense does not arise. But the worth or the usefulness of these liberties is different. It's not the same for all, since the difference principle permits some persons will have greater income and wealth than others, and so they will have greater all-purpose means for advancing their ends. It will be true, of course, that when the difference principle is satisfied, the basic structure maximizes, in this index sense, the index of primary goods for the least advantage, so that they can make use of the equal basic liberties enjoyed by everyone. So in that sense, you might say there is some compensation, but I don't think it's adequate unless something else is said. Does that continue making noise? Or I mean, does that bother people? I sort of hear an underground rumble from somewhere. I don't seem to be able to avoid it. Well, this distinction between the equal basic liberties and their worth is merely a definition. And of course, it doesn't solve any interesting or important problems. It's just a definition. It's not supposed to solve any problem. The problem that the political liberties then may prove merely fundamental, merely formal, still remains, and want to say something about it. And what I think that we have to do, at least I suggest doing, is that we treat the equal political liberties in the actual way. This is done by including in the principles of justice a proviso that these liberties, and only these liberties, are to be secured by what in the text is called the fair value. And this is explained and introduced in 224 to 27 of chapter 4. And it is a vague notion, and it's hard to be very exact about this, but I think it is a problem that ought to be noticed, and one also there's a problem connected with, which I'll go on to consider in a moment. Now, the idea of fair value is that it guarantees, and it means that the worth of the political liberties of all citizens, whatever their economic or social position, must be sufficiently equal in the sense that everyone has a fair opportunity to hold political office and to influence the outcome of elections. Obviously, that's going to be very hard to do, but that's what the idea is. And that idea of fair opportunity then will parallel the sense of fair opportunity in the second principle of justice. Now, when the principles are adopted in the original position, it's understood that the first principle includes this proviso, and that the parties will take it into account in their reasoning. Thus, when we try to assess the way in which the two principles of justice provide an understanding of the expected claims of liberty and equality, and whether or not that way in which they are dealt with is appropriate, we then have to be sure that we're taking the fair value, the political liberties into account. That's part of the idea. Now, I shall not here discuss how that can be provided for, how that can be done by political arrangements, or indeed whether there exists some practicable way of doing this which is compatible with the essentials of the other liberties. I mean, that I think is a very important problem. And I'm not going to attempt to say anything about it, except one ought not to underestimate first its importance and the very great difficulties involved. It is a problem, I think it hasn't been studied very much for a very long time, but that's another matter. Perhaps if we did, we might make some progress on how it could be done in a feasible way. But there is another question which is associated with this, namely, why not secure the fair value for all the basic liberties? This suggestion then would carry the idea of equality further than is done in today, for the two principles with this fair value of the political liberties proviso are kind of a focal point, natural focal point between the two principles without any proviso, and the two principles that include a notion of fair value for all the political liberties. And we'll want to discuss the question why one doesn't do the latter. Now, I think that the idea of the more comprehensive guarantee is either irrational or superfluous or socially divisive. There might be various ways of how one might interpret it. If it means that income and wealth are to be distributed equally, and I take income and wealth as sort of a stand-in for these material means. If they are to be distributed equally, then it seems to me that the more extensive proviso would be irrational, since it does not allow society to meet the requirements of social organization and of economic efficiency, and there are also, I think, other problems with that. If it means that, as if this guarantee means that each person to be assured some fixed amount of income and wealth as a way of expressing the ideal of securing the equal worth of the equal liberties, then it is superfluous, because in effect the difference principle already does that. So if that was the interpretation of it, it would be superfluous. If it means that the distribution of income is to take place according to the content of certain interests regarded as central, for example, take again that of the religious interest, then I think it's socially divisive. Some persons may count, for example, among their religious duties, say going on pilgrimages to far-off places, or building magnificent cathedrals or temples. Thus, to guarantee the equal worth of religious liberty to them would presumably mean devoting social resources to such persons rather than to persons who interpret their religious duties as making more modest claims on social resources. We don't, the propriety of ways in which these things could be subsidized. Now, the latter, that is, people who make more modest claims on social resources, presumably one might say that their religious needs are, as it were, less, so we give them less. I think plainly that this interpretation of what the fair value across the board would mean would be socially divisive. Or you might say that's an unfair example, or it's an unusual example. So one might take another example of someone whose very important, predominant aim in life is to learn about the solar system. And in order to do that, one has to build them, say, radio telescopes and a whole variety of complicated things in order for them to know that. So we might interpret this principle of fair value of all the liberties to mean society should make an attempt to make an equal, proportionate contribution to the fulfillment of anyone's conception of the good. Now, if I'm, say, a mathematician, all I need is paper and pencil, suppose. I'm a radio, if I have this other idea which I just described, that's not enough. I need a radio telescope costing $100 million. And we then have a problem to fulfill this rather costly conception of the good. Now, recall that the principle is to make an equal proportionate contribution to that conception, regardless of the social effects for other people that it would have. This is a first principle to make a proportionate contribution to everyone's conception of the good. So it's now irrelevant that, say, building these telescopes has indirect consequences that may be socially valuable. So there again, I think, if we think through what this principle involves, although I did take a rather extraordinary case, but there are other examples for which you can work out, I think at any rate, or I suggest, that the principle of proportionate satisfaction as a way to read the fair value for all the basic liberties is socially divisive. It isn't divisive on religious grounds, perhaps, but it's divisive on other grounds. So the idea would be that if you have a conception of the good that is expensive and costly to satisfy, and plenty of us do, there's no harm in that as such, but you, on this view, you mustn't expect to have the resources for it to be satisfied unless that makes a contribution to other people, and in this particular view, along the lines of the difference principle. Whatever the principle is, perhaps you don't like that principle, there ought to be, in any case, I think most of us would think, some social contribution. And I think that similar consequences will follow whenever the public conception of justice adjusts citizens' claims to social resources so that some receive more than others, depending on the determinate final ends and loyalties that belong to their conception of the good. In other words, again, well, that's taken as a sufficient reason and not indirectly to its social contributions of those people. Whenever there cannot be a public agreement on a conception of the good as the basis for political justice, then I think the basis of social unity is best founded on some public conception of justice that judges citizens' claims to social resources in terms of something like what I call primary good. And what makes it possible, I suppose, for a society like the societies of the Middle Ages to put public resources into the buildings of these cathedrals that we like to see, does depend on the fact that social unity based on some perhaps conception of the good, one might be able to say that. Certainly it's based on there being but one dominant religion that is able to enforce that. And while the cathedrals are indeed beautiful, one has to again see the conditions that make it possible, without intending to criticize that from a present standpoint, because in a way that's irrelevant. What makes it possible? The same kind of things that would not be possible for us because it wouldn't have that kind of agreement. And when one does not have that kind of agreement, then one, I think, is led to another kind of conception of justice that begins the way in which T.J. does, as an example, other ways of doing it, from the notion of society as a scheme of cooperation, etc. And that imposes a variety of constraints on what can be done. Well, I'll make some concluding remarks very briefly about the content interpretation. This is talked about in section 40. I don't plan to go into that, just to make some comments about it. I think there are two sections in particular of TJ that can be very misleading as to the relation between the view in the book, justice as fairness, and Kant's doctrine. And these sections are section 40 and 85. And I guess if I were writing them over again, I'd be a little bit more careful and explicit. But that's by the by. I think the main point is this, that while it is a case that the view of called justice as fairness has many structural features in common with Kant's doctrine of the moral law. That is the notion of priority of right, that the idea that the reasonable subordinates the rational, and so on, through all the steps. One makes that distinction that has depth features, also has these features of equal basic liberty, in the sense it's also in Kant's doctrine, and which we read from the metaphysic of right. And there's also the idea of the plurality of conceptions of the good, which are incomparable and in some ways irreconcilable, and so forth. Those structural features are in common, not that they are identical, but there are parallels there that are important parallels. And I would want to emphasize the parallel. This is a certain kind of conception. And it distinguishes it from teleological views in general. It distinguishes it from utilitarianism in particular. And that really is a basic aspect of the view. So there are these structural properties about the conception that are shared with Kant's view, and that is very important in order to understand it and to see how it contrasts with other views. But to say that a view has that parallel, or to say that it's a Kantian view, is not the same as to say that it's Kant's view in all respects. You might say analogy is not identity, and so on. And one has to be aware of what the differences are. And the differences, I think, is that the view that I've called justice as fairness does not depend, and again this is vague, does not depend on Kant's metaphysical views of reason, say any notions of that he has, by which he tries to explain that reason of finus. Now, it's not a reason or rational, it's a finus, complicated notion, that's a priori. All of that, the metaphysics of transcendental idealism, I don't think enters in any essential way, so far as I can see, and is not required. And the same thing would be true about notions that Kant had about the conception of the person that one thought was a metaphysical. Now, what I would want to say, again, this is vague and one has two examples, is that the conception in TJ is not a metaphysical conception at all, but it's a conception of political justice that begins from fundamental intuitive ideas which are said to be in some sense in the public culture and they have to be developed, and the conception which is finally worked out, which begins from the conception or the fundamental intuitive idea, I should say, of society as a system of fair cooperation, all that beginning up from that in the end has to be adjusted and moved with, and to be able to work up into what we say is our reflective equilibrium with our considered judgments. That's the phrase that I've used. Now it's hard to give a definition, a useful definition of what a metaphysical conception is, and I won't attempt to do that. But one example, for example, is that one can say the idea of a prior and independent moral order of values that can be grasped by rational intuition is a metaphysical idea. It's an idea that accounts for the notions of how moral judgments can be true. We say these judgments are accurate of, or they are accurate assertions about this prior independent order. An old example of that would be if you interpret Plato's forms as in some way representing values, and that would be an example of that prior independent order. There are many examples of it. It doesn't have to take that form. It's in Moore, it's in Rawls, it's in a lot of other writers. And it provides the basis of saying that there must be an answer to every moral question. The idea of an independent, prior independent order suggests that moral questions in general have answers, unless you say that this order is somehow porous and has holes in it, say it only requires a few things. But in general, one has the idea that most, if not all, moral questions have answers. And the view that T.J. suggests, and it's a little bit unnerving, is that most moral questions do not have answers. That rather few of them have answers. And what makes a wise or a sensible political conception is that you find those that do have answers of a kind, and that are also important. In other words, a good political theory finds an important question that has an answer. And that, in a way, I think is enough. If we could answer a few important questions and convince others of there being a certain kind of answer about it, that would be a lot. Well, I'm going over, I could go on forever about this, so I had better stop. But just remember that people have discussed at the time of Plato, if you like, what should be the relation between citizens in society, about distributive justice, and in a way you might say, viewed from a certain point of view, there's not an agreed answer to it. So, well, in any case, I have said that I'm not helping.